This is a Speedpaint starter set from Army Painter. Now, is this really going to be the one-stop shop, the one single coat solution that it claims to be? Well, today we're going to find out. We're going to test them, we're going to find out how these paints really behave, the sort of effects you can actually realistically get, but also we're going to test it to find out the things that you might want to avoid. So this is the Speedpaint starter set from Army Painter. Now this is the smallest of the sets, I believe, and you can get massive ones that have the entire range. Now this particular set I was lent by a friend of mine to test out, so thanks Chris. Now if you haven't come across speed paints yet, then they're basically Army Painter's version of contrast paints. So what is actually in this set? Okay, so open it up. So first of all you get this Army Painter painting guide. So after having a quick look through this, it's actually pretty good, especially for a brand new painter. It covers a lot of the basics. Interestingly though, it doesn't mention speed paints once, as far as I can tell. Which is interesting for an instruction book in a speed painting box set. So in this box itself, you've got 10 speed paints. Now you've got quite a nice range of colours here. So you've got a grey, a purpley, blue, greens, browns, and then through to the reds and oranges, and then through to the kind of the sort of beigey kind of colour. For a colour range, it's not a bad starter set. Okay, so they're all in dropper bottles, and they feel quite solid and quite decent quality. They don't feel like they're going to fall apart straight away. What's also quite nice is that every single bottle has a little mixer ball already inside it. So when you shake it, you've already got that mixer ball to agitate it and mix it up. And especially as it says on the box that you need to really make sure these are shaken up really, really well before you use them, then that's quite handy. Okay, so let's see how these paints actually behave. So first of all, I'm going to tear off a piece of parchment paper here, sort of greaseproof paper that you might find in the kitchen, so we can put it through its first test. The first test is going to be about how it handles, so the consistency, how it flows, that kind of thing. Okay, so just so we can keep track of what colour is what, then I'm going to quickly write out all the colour names. Okay, and let's start with the Grave Lord of Grey. So I'm going to treat these all the same. I'm going to give them the same amount of mixing, etc., to try and make it as comparable as I can. So I'm already quite glad that he wrote down all the names, because when they first come out of the pot, the first thing to note is, yeah, they kind of all look the same kind of colour, apart from that blue, the green, and the yellow, which kind of looks much more like an orangey red at the moment. Okay, so let's spread it out a little bit. So getting a clean, slightly damp paintbrush and then just spreading out that paint, I'm already starting to notice a little bit of difference in the consistency between the paints. Now, to be fair, this is fairly standard across paints. Different colours require different amounts of pigment and different fillers and everything else in it. So it's quite standard for different colours to have slightly different consistencies even within the same range. But what's interesting is that Zealot Yellow, it seems to be a little bit thinner. It covers differently, a bit better than some of the other colours, but it seems a lot thinner. Likewise, that Pallid Bone is a lot thinner. It's almost like a shade, really. Okay, so I've left that for an hour or so now, and it's pretty much at least touch dry. So, running a damp brush over the top of it, then obviously I'm not convinced it was completely dry in places, or it's reactivated. However, on some areas, especially the lighter colours, then you can almost wash it away. So yeah, it does kind of react a little bit to water even after it's dried, and it will kind of wash away. So that's one thing to be aware of. Now that could be an issue, it could be a problem, but it could also be an opportunity, which we'll test out later on. Now when it comes to painting minis with speed paints, there's normally two main ways that people will do it. The first is kind of the standard way that Army Painter recommends that you do it, which is painting directly onto a white or a grey primer. So that's what we're going to test out first. So first of all, we're going to try out the Pallid Bone, which is that kind of beigey kind of colour, on this Vespid Stingwing from the Tau Warhammer 40k range. Now, I've already primed this in a Vallejo Mecha grey primer, and I'm just painting that straight onto it. I'm trying to let it pool into some of the more recesses, but not overwork it. So next we're going to try the Fire Giant Orange. And once again, on the paper, straight out of the pot, it looks almost black. But when you're going over that white primer, it's quite a bright orange. Now what's interesting, it is kind of pooling in those recesses, in the cracks, in between those plates on the back. Now that is the effect that Army Painter kind of expects to get. So next let's go for that Zealot Yellow. Now I did get a little bit over enthusiastic with the orange, and it's kind of spilled over onto that shoulder a little bit. Now because it's so thin, it does spread very quickly. Now one thing I'm learning with this stuff already is you can't just slap it on. You need to still be fairly careful with it. So because it is so thin, it will flow, and it may well flow to parts of the model you didn't quite intend it to. Especially if you're painting a section which is next to an area which is still wet. So for example, we've got the thorax of the Stingwing here, it's next to the wing. Now the wing is still wet, the thorax is now wet, and the two paints are kind of sliding and blending into each other. But the effect I'm getting from that is actually quite interesting. So what I'm going to try now is, I've noticed that the paints tend to swirl and merge together. I wonder if I can do that deliberately. So now on the palette, I'm going to put a drop of that Hive Dweller purple, that Gravelin grey, and that Hardened leather. And then kind of swirl them together a little bit, also with a little bit of that yellow we used earlier as well. Not really mix it up, just kind of swirl it together, and let's see what the effect we get there. So at the moment it's looking very brown, but you can also see little bits of darker browns, a little bit of purpley in there. Also the yellow's coming through in places as well. So I think I might leave that to dry and then see how that dries off. Okay, so on the gun here, I'm going to use some of that blue, just mainly because I want to try out the blue and see how it works. Now what I'm finding quite interesting here is that the paint is flowing into areas of the model that I hadn't actually really seen before, or in any particular detail. I'm quite liking the detail of the body, the segmented areas of the Stingwing here. So it's now looking a lot more wasp-like than it did before. So let's try some of that dark grey on there and see how that comes out. Okay, so you can layer these paints to a point. The second layer will be more dominant than the layers put underneath, but because they are still quite translucent, you will get little elements of those colours still coming through. Okay, so at the minute it's looking a bit of a mess. So let's let that dry. We'll do the next test and then we'll come back to it. Okay, so the next test we're going to do is the second technique that you'll see mentioned quite a lot when it comes to speed paints, and that's slap chop. Now slap chop basically takes that first technique we did and added a little bit more complexity into it. So therefore you start off with a black base, and this time you go in with a dry brush with a grey, and you do a heavy dry brush over the whole thing to kind of bring out some of that detail. So you've got the darkest shadow in that black, and you've now got everything else, the raised areas, in that grey. Now standard slap chop, you'll then go straight to white, but what I have found is you can get a better result by going over the grey again, or a lighter grey. So you get a transition between that grey and the white. So I'm going to go over again with the grey, same grey again, dry brush, but slightly lighter this time. So once that is dry, then going over the nice bright white. Now of course you can use different colours, both as your base colour, so swap the black out for a red or a green or whatever you fancy, but then transition that through to the white. Okay, so we've now got a nice monochromatic sketch from that black through to the bright white. And to try and make it as equal and comparable as possible, I'm going to do exactly the same colour scheme that we did for the first model on this one, so we can see how the two techniques kind of differ. Okay, so starting with the pallid bone again, and then going over those wings. Now already you can notice there's a lot more contrast in here. The shadows are a lot darker and the highlights are a lot brighter. But what I found with this stuff, it is tricky to know what your final result is going to be until you've given it time to dry, because the colours change so dramatically from when it's wet to when it's dry. So moving on to the Fire Giant Orange for the body area. Now what I'm finding with this stuff, it is thick enough to push around, so you can sort of move the paint into areas where you want a darker shadow to be, for example, or likewise you can move it away from areas that you want to have a brighter finish. So with the stronger contrast of slap chop, that Zealot yellow is really kind of popping a lot stronger colour than it was with the standard approach. So also on those areas where I pushed the orange away, I can then drop that yellow in and it kind of flows out and blends quite nicely with that orange. That's quite an interesting effect. Now on the face is looking quite orange, so therefore I'm going to use this dry brush, slightly damp, and just kind of almost scrub away some of the orange off the raised areas of the face. Okay, so I'm going to mix up that same mix we did before with those four colours, and then just paint it over the arms and legs of this thing. Okay, so whilst those two are drying, I'm going to quickly base them up, and then we can take a look and see what we've got. Okay, to be fair, this took a little bit of playing with to get my head around, but I'm generally quite surprised. Okay, so with the standard version, going straight over that white-grey primer, then it looks a lot more blocky. It doesn't look, there's nowhere near as much depth into it, and it also looks a bit more messy. I think it's largely because I haven't got the definition to separate out the individual pieces of the model. But looking at the slap chop version, there's a lot more detail in there. I think it's once again largely because of the definition, but also I'm quite intrigued and quite liking the different colours, the slight colour shifts on the legs. Mixing those colours together, they have kind of separated out ever so slightly. It's not just gone into one kind of brown paint. So you do have little areas that are purple, areas the brown, areas the yellow kind of coming through. And it does look quite like exoskeleton shell-like. I wasn't expecting that. That's quite an interesting result. So going on to the back. Now, to be fair, off camera, I did go back over both of these and go over the black sections on the body with that grey a second time. So I let it dry completely and then go back over it. So that's one interesting thing, is you can build up a stronger colour by letting it dry and then going back over certain sections with the same colour again. Okay, so in conclusion, is this the one-stop shop solution? Is it the magic bullet for painting minis? Depends on what you're looking for. But going purely by the results from today's tests, but stylistically it's a very, very different look. If anything, it's more like watercolour than oil paint or acrylic paint, which in itself can be awesome, if that's what you're looking for. So is this the one-stop shop, the one-coat solution that Army Painter promised? Well, I would argue no, but it is interesting. Now today we tested a comparatively small model that had a comparative amount of detail and raised surfaces and recesses to allow that paint to pool and to drain away from the highlights, as it's kind of designed to do. But how does it work on large scale models or areas with larger, flatter areas, like Space Marines, for example? Well, if you want to explore more how we can play with this stuff, then check out this video right here. If you like that, if you found that useful, please bash that like button and share it across your social media. And I'll see you for the next project.